As Donna indicated, what she just read to you is a resolution that was presented to Unitarian Universalist delegates at the UUA General Assembly in Portland, Oregon in June of this year. The resolution, titled "Support the Black Lives Matter Movement," was adopted by a vote that required at least 66% approval. So what does that mean? It means that a supermajority of UU congregations across this country, congregations that UUCJ is connected to via a covenantal relationship, called us to action, called us to support the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter, or BLM, has been in the news a lot this summer. The movement has been criticized and condemned from both the right and the left, from both whites and blacks. So this morning, I'd like to lead us in learning a little bit more about BLM and take a closer look at some of the critiques that have been levied against it. On July 13, 2013, a nearly all-white jury found George Zimmerman not guilty of murdering unarmed black teenager Trayvon Martin. A community organizer, a black woman named Alicia Garza, was sitting in a bar in Oakland, California when the verdict was announced. When she saw the verdict, Garza wrote an impassioned Facebook message that ended with the words, "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter." Garza's friend and fellow community organizer Patrice Cullors saw the message and shared it, adding the hashtag Black Lives Matter. Garza and Cullors then reached out to a third community organizer they knew, Opal Tometi. Together, these three women sketched out the framework for what has come to be known as the Black Lives Matter movement. The movement gained traction in 2014 with the extrajudicial killings of unarmed black men Michael Brown and Eric Garner, and then continued to pick up steam throughout 2015 as countless other unarmed black men and women were brutalized and killed by police. BLM started as a reaction specifically to police brutality against black Americans, but its focus has since expanded to multiple and varied expressions of systemic racism and white supremacy in our country. Black Lives Matter is both a movement and an organized network. On a national level, the BLM network is headed by Garza, Cullors, and Tometi. Together, they have, among other things, established a strong social media platform, rallied a freedom ride to Ferguson, Missouri last year, organized a national convention in Cleveland. They also recently published a list of policy demands aimed to end police brutality. It's called Campaign Zero, and it's available online. But the majority of the approximately 1,000 BLM demonstrations that have occurred over the last year and a half have been organized on the local level. There are official local BLM chapters and other independently existing organizations that are affiliated with the BLM network. Then there are individuals and groups that are informally connected to the network, and others who have no official connection to the network at all, but nevertheless still use the hashtag Black Lives Matter in their communications and social actions. Now, this organizational structure has sometimes led to confusion about exactly who can and does speak for the network, what the network's official message is, and how it will be communicated. That confusion has even led to a more philosophical question about whether the BLM network even has the right to speak on behalf of the larger BLM movement. I would like to suggest that part of this confusion is a natural result of the fact that BLM is a strategically decentralized network and movement that exists and coheres because of social media. That point cannot be stressed enough. Like the Arab Spring, BLM happened and is happening because of cell phones, the internet, and platforms like Facebook and Twitter. The ubiquity of cell phones today, and especially among young people, means that nearly every American has a camera and a recording device on them at all times. So for the first time in history, the actions of police officers in everyday encounters are being surveilled by the people and instantaneously being posted online for the world to see without filter, without editing, without editorialization. organization. Unlike in decades past, we're no longer simply hearing stories secondhand about police brutality. We can now see it and hear it with our own eyes and ears. Because of social media, our world is becoming a place where there will no longer be any more secrets. For the first time, light is being shined into some of the dark corners of our nation, and many of us are being disturbed by what we are seeing. It's an incredibly democratic phenomenon. If you are a person and you can get on the internet, then you have a voice. And regardless of who you are, where you come from, the color of your skin, the clothes you wear, or the type of car you drive, if you have something to say, and that something is compelling, then your voice will be heard, and it will be amplified. The realm of social media represents a decentralized landscape of flattened hierarchies, accessible to almost everyone, webs of interconnected mutual social networks full of individuals and groups reporting and reacting instantaneously in real time to images and events as they occur. As a social media-driven network and movement, BLM is going to mirror the characteristics of the social media landscape where it was born and lives. To those not accustomed to swimming in such fast-moving, turbulent waters, it can seem like chaos. Yet, a sort of order does emerge over time. Currents establish themselves and are identified by those who are paying attention. And I think it should be remembered that the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was similarly turbulent. It's a trick of history to look backwards and think that it was a single, unified, clearly defined, organized movement, with one leader leading one organization, with one philosophy and one methodology. What we now today call the civil rights movement was actually several movements scattered across geographic locations with several different groups, leaders, philosophies, and methodologies that often butted heads with one another. It wasn't all just MLK, nonviolence, and singing "We Shall Overcome." So if we all passively sit around, waiting for the next great civil rights movement, expecting that surely it must needs look like that beautifully organized utopic myth, we will probably be waiting until the end of days. And frankly, there are many people who would be just fine with that. Turbulence is one trait that the civil rights movement shares with BLM, but in other ways, BLM looks very different. Unlike the civil rights movement, BLM is not a movement led by highly visible, charismatic men in suits holding press conferences. Because it's driven by social media, BLM is a people's movement and an intentionally inclusive one. The founders of the movement from the beginning have stressed that in this movement, there will be recognition that all Black lives matter. That includes gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, and trans Black lives. As you can imagine, this has led it to fall out of favor with several theologically conservative Black churches. Yet another example how this movement will differ from the civil rights movement, which relied extensively on organized religion and ministers to herald its gospel. But the most widespread critique of BLM is from people, oftentimes, though not always, people on the conservative side of the political spectrum who claim that it is an anti-white expression of reverse racism. These are the people who like to counter the claim Black lives matter with the mantra, all lives matter. Now, in a terribly reductionist manner, I'm going to suggest there are two kinds of people who promote the phrase, all lives matter. The first group is comprised of well-meaning individuals who have been taught that drawing special attention to any person or group based on race is by definition racist, and therefore automatically evil. Thus, among these folks, drawing special attention to Black lives is reverse racism. A couple of points I want to make here. Now, if we understood the concept of racism in 21st century terms, not the older definition from the 1950s, then we must conclude that reverse racism doesn't actually exist. It's not a thing. Now, can a black person today have an unfairly prejudiced view of white people that leads him or her to commit racially discriminatory acts? Absolutely, of course. So if this were 1950, you could say that such a black person was a reverse racist. But understanding racism in 21st century terms, as used by social scientists in 2015, we understand that racism is a form of systemic oppression in which one racial group uses their position of power and privilege, wittingly or unwittingly, to exploit a less powerful, less privileged racial group. So to simplify, in 2015 terms, racism equals prejudice plus power. By that definition, reverse racism doesn't actually exist because black Americans as a group are not in a position of power or privilege over white Americans. Those who believe in reverse racism also tend to believe that the highest expression of a non-racist society is one that is completely colorblind. Now, in fairness, this was the prevalent anti-racist philosophy that was taught to many of us during and after the civil rights movement. I was taught that. Don't judge others by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That famous sentiment, taken from the text of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, has been used like a scriptural proof text to prove that colorblindness must be the true pinnacle of racial enlightenment. I'm here this morning to tell you that it's not. Colorblindness is actually itself a pernicious form of racism. Pretending not to see color, culture, or ethnicity in others, it invalidates, devalues, erases the identities of people of color. Colorblindness perpetuates the idea that color or race or ethnicity is shameful, something to be politely ignored in social settings. Colorblindness prevents us from seeing and acknowledging true and tragic racial disparities in the world today, thereby ensuring that we will not act to end those racial disparities. Colorblindness leads us to ignore the fact that people of color have a very different experience of what it means to be an American as compared to whites. Colorblindness suggests that there is but a single, unified, correct way of seeing the world and interfacing with it, and it so happens that this correct way looks really white. Colorblindness encourages us to stop talking about racial issues altogether, which then protects white people from having to experience any discomfort from realizing how much we continue to benefit from the massive inequalities that still exist in our world today. In other words, colorblindness allows white people to continue to feel comfortable with the status quo. When has any kind of voluntary blindness ever been a good thing? Instead of willful colorblindness, let us consider embracing multiculturalism, which prompts us to recognize the diversity of our world, to learn about and value the differences we all have with one another, not erase them. So for these well-intentioned people raised to believe in the virtue of a colorblind society, and I was one of them, Black Lives Matter appears racist because it draws attention to race. The phrase all lives matter, on the other hand, is colorblind and therefore equated to be good. But even if you don't buy the idea that being colorblind is bad, I still think it's actually pretty easy to disarm the all lives matter argument. Here's one way of explaining it. Here's how I like to explain it. Let's say someone runs into your knee and sprains it. So you go to the doctor. You tell the doctor about your knee pain and you ask him to look at it and fix it. So the doctor begins examining your eyes, then your ears, then your nose, then your throat, starts looking at your arms, your neck, your feet. Then he writes an order to have your brain CAT scan. At this point, you stop him and say, "But wait, doctor, it's my knee that's been injured." Imagine the doctor responding, "Nope, all body parts matter, and I'm going to treat them all equally. It would be morally wrong for me to give special attention to the injured body part. I must give equal attention to all body parts at all times." You probably should stop seeing that doctor. Of course, all lives matter. But right now in America, they don't. At least not equally. In order to make all lives matter a true statement, we must open our eyes to the fact that our society does not currently value the lives of people of color the same way it values the lives of white people. So if you're gonna claim all lives matter, then you damn well better be ready to prove it by actively tearing down systems of oppression that currently make the lives of black people worth less than the lives of white people. So that's one group of people who use the phrase, all lives matter. Well-intentioned folks who were taught colorblindness was an ultimate good, and who probably can ultimately be persuaded to see things a little differently now. Now, the second group of people who propagate the ideology of all lives matter, they are pretty much straight up blatant racists who don't like black people. I'm gonna call it like I see it. Speak with these people at your own peril. Reasoning with them probably won't work. But it's not just the political conservatives who take issue with BLM. Liberals have their concerns and critiques as well. Many Democrats, especially those who work directly for the party or are strongly aligned with the party, are becoming a little anxious. They fear that by disrupting campaign stops of popular Democratic presidential candidates and publicly rejecting the DNC's official support, that BLM is driving a wedge between black Americans and the party. And if the Democrats lose the black vote, but maybe that's exactly what needs to happen for Democrats to finally take black people seriously. Now, I know that I'm in a room surrounded by Democrats, many who could very well argue that the Democratic Party does in fact care about black people and black issues, and that the Democratic Party is by far the better choice for discerning black Americans as compared to the Republicans. But sometimes I wonder if such confidence leads to a certain kind of deafness. See, for a long time, black folks have been telling the Democratic Party that their needs are not being met, that they and their votes are being taken for granted, that the policy of change by gradualism endorsed by the Democratic Party feels like a lot of empty promises. This is precisely what led the Reverend Al Sharpton in 2003 to write these words. The Democratic Party acts like we are their mistress, like we're some scarlet whore rather than their respected partner. Either we're gonna have a healthy marriage or we're getting a divorce. Although Sharpton is not associated with the BLM network, a lot of Democrats right now fear that BLM may be making good on Sharpton's threat. So, all this discussion leaves us still with the great question, what do we do? UUCJ. Do we become allies of the Black Lives Matter movement and/or its network? Do we continue to work on racial justice on our own without building those relationships? Do we simply stand on the sidelines altogether? These are questions that we as a congregation need to ask ourselves. There are several UU congregations across the country who have decided to support BLM by putting Black Lives Matter banners up on their campuses. Now, if we decide as a congregation to support the BLM movement, the decision of erecting a banner will also be something that we will need to discuss and decide upon, and I will say this as something to consider on that specific point. On the one hand, recognizing that we are still a predominantly white congregation, raising a sign like this would be a very powerful symbol, a powerful message to the black community that we are here ready to support, ready to be allies in the struggle for racial justice. There is today a deafening white silence when it comes to the struggles faced by people of color in this country. So by taking such a visible stand against current-day racism, we would be helping to shatter that silence. On the other hand, there's also a long legacy of white exploitation, narcissism, and appropriation that must be a part of this discussion. See if our actual motive in visibly supporting the BLM movement is simply so we can grow the membership of our church or simply gain acclaim within certain liberal circles, then we're not really supporting black people. we are exploiting them for our own profit. If we celebrate the vandalism of our BLM sign, which will undoubtedly happen, if we, a primarily white congregation, revel in our so-called suffering for the cause and glory in our sign's vinyl martyrdom, instead of keeping the focus on the true suffering and plight of Black Americans, then we will be expressing a form of white narcissism. If we promote the BLM message without first seeking to establish a relationship with the individuals and groups locally who are actually leading the movement here in Jacksonville, then we risk co-opting it, speaking on behalf of the still nascent movement. And instead of acting in a supporting role, instead of being an ally, we will be casting ourselves as the stars and the directors. This is a form of white appropriation. I believe that whatever we choose to do, we must walk humbly, and we must seek to create authentic relationships with those who are leading the fight. But most of all, whatever we do, we cannot allow our decisions to be ruled by fear. Some of us might be a little afraid to rock the boat, but that's okay. Unitarian Universalists have always been the boat rockers. It's in our DNA. A couple of years ago, Sister Simone Campbell spoke to us at the UUA General Assembly, and she noted that on the journey of faith, we will often be asked to walk towards trouble. I believe that is the heart of our collective faith. When others run from trouble, our faith compels us to walk towards it, come what may. And if that is what is called for here and now, then I invite all of us to take those fateful steps. Blessed be.